siis. Good afternoon, and welcome to this first afternoon session here. It is a true honor for me to moderate this panel with two amazing women who are going to talk about the things at heart relating to gender equality and women in conflict situations. We have our former president, Kersti Kaljulaid. She was in this position from 2016 to 2021. And during her presidency, she was vocal advocate for human rights, rule of law, freedom of speech, for democracy. All these things we are going to talk about today and have talked about today. And for my greatest happiness, she was also the patron of our Security Council campaign and played a major role in Estonia's election to the council in 2019. And on top of everything, in 2021, she was appointed the first global advocate for every woman, every child by the United Nations Secretary General. Welcome. And then we also have Ms. Regnér, and she serves as Assistant Secretary General of the UN and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women since 2018. But prior to that, Ms. Regnér served since 2014 as Minister for Children, Elderly and Gender Equality of Sweden. And she has extensive experience in the area of gender equality and women's empowerment and has held various leadership positions in government, non-governmental organizations and now at the UN too. So as we know, the situation for women in the world is difficult to say the least in many fronts. And it's also due to the decline in democracy, human rights, abuses in general, the setbacks the pandemic has left, the large number of conflicts, the all-time high humanitarian needs, as well as the more than worrying refugee situation. And nevertheless, even in this environment, we should mainly focus on the potential of women. Also in relation to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, since we are at the setting of a Security Council conference, and we have a war in Europe. So let us be guided by the words of youngest Nobel Peace Prize laureate Malala Yousafzai. We cannot all succeed when half of us are held back. So the first question, I would like to have a little introduction, go back to the New York City 2010, the summer of 2010, when I had my personal experience as Estonia led the negotiations on creating the UN Women, and I was the main expert in our mission. It was a long process and actually seemed to have collapsed also many times. But finally, we agreed, meaning that all of the countries of the United Nations voted unanimously to create UN entity for gender equality and the empowerment of women, to be known as UN Women. And when we think of the name and also the fact that we see countries, including in Europe, finding it difficult to even agree on using the term gender equality. So, President Kaljulaid, from your vast experience as well as your role as the first global advocate for every woman, every child, how do you see the situation at the moment regarding gender equality, and what are you hoping to be your achievements as a global advocate?
Well, as a global advocate, I've set myself mainly three objectives: to fight against starvation, also to deal with maternal mortality, try to understand and break down what are the different reasons for maternal mortality, which could be, despite the fact that the numbers are very similar, be very different. I mean, in some place there is lack of trained medical workforce. In some place there is no tradition of taking women to doctors, but the outside view could be exactly the same. So we need to have better information where our NGOs and other bodies could actually work and be useful. Because I have seen indeed cases where we are not working at the bottleneck always and every time. So trying to make data better and better used in our work. And also third is digital technologies in helping women and children and adolescents. And here I do not mean actually training girls with digital skills so much, because frankly speaking, for most of the world where you go and help girls to get digital skills, you are helping middle or even upper middle class. So my emphasis has been more in trying to create projects which will spearhead the online registration of children born, because this would really help the biggest proportion of women and children. As we all know, there are very many children in some countries, it could be up to 20-25% who never get registered. And we now have globally seen that actually we are able to keep and verify global registries. I'm thinking of vaccination certificates. Mm-hmm. And we should create a system where every baby can be registered either into the national digital registry or into the general, maybe UN held digital registry, because some people simply do not want to let their government know that they have a family. So I see here we have lots of work to do. On the other hand, when I took up this job, and we were speaking also at UN Women, UNICEF and other bodies, everybody warned me that statistically, when your period is over, we'll be worse off. So I had to accept that I'm starting at the point in history where we all know that when I'm finishing, statistically, things look worse. Because we already knew women have not been going to doctors. Women have been forced to stay home. Even in the best countries in the world, I mean, it's women whose position has been rolled back because, of course, who takes care of the family. We're discussing this at one forum where we had a very nice gay moderator, and he said, yes, indeed, you know, in my family it was so hard to agree who takes care of the children because there was no obvious candidate. So this is the world. And of course, if we start like in Sweden or Estonia, where women have achieved maybe 80% of the equality, then we roll back, we get still sitting at 70. But if you are somewhere in the least developed nations and you were already hovering close to zero, you are deep in negative territory. So actually, I'm quite pessimistic about where we're going.
Thank you very much. Yes, unfortunately, it's pretty negative outlook. But also, Regnér, the rights of women have been having setbacks in many countries in recent years. And how can the international community, organizations such as UN Women, who is in the forefront, counter this trend, if there are ways of empowering women?
Well, thank you so much. And I think the obvious and first answer is political will and leadership. We have one example here. That makes all the difference. This is not some force of nature that had decided that the setbacks will be as was described here. It is actually because of lack of political will, or even political will, that things should go backwards. But from UN Women's side, we took stock of the situation and the developments in the world in terms of gender equality 2 years ago, when the Beijing Platform for Action was 25 years old. The meeting in Beijing in 1995 was the latest world conference, UN conference on women's rights, because since then the resistance has grown and it has not been possible to open that document. So we took stock of it 2 years ago, and then we saw that on the one hand there is good news, there is political will, and luckily it is in some areas by many enough countries, let's say. So we have much better legislation on, for example, violence against women. We even have reforms actually in 90 countries where fathers have some right to stay at home with their newborns or toddlers. The problem, however, is that even when there is better legislation, it is not implemented, because there is not enough political will to create structures to implement the legislation, and most of all, to fund it. It's a highly underfunded area. And so, obviously, we are happy about the better legislation in some of these areas, but it's very worrying that the implementation, the reality, is lagging behind so much, and that's when we get the reality that the former president described. And when you add the COVID experience, we saw that COVID really disproportionately affected women socioeconomically. We have described this from UN Women's side pretty in detail, I would like to say, so I would recommend you, if you're interested, to go to our homepage. We have lots of briefs on how this played out. I think also right now, there is really, we just now, and it's difficult for me to not mention it, on Saturday morning Estonian time, we came out of difficult negotiations during the Commission on the Status of Women. This commission meets every year, always on ministerial level. It's one of the few commissions that actually meet on ministerial level. And its results are agreed conclusions on women's rights. We managed to get a result this year. The topic was women's rights in the context of climate change, which is obviously highly important. And we do have agreements there about, for example, the connection between the fact that climate change drives conflict and that those conflicts affect women disproportionately, which have been difficult agreements in other forums, and also support for other important women's rights in this context. And we did this right now. But we do see that although the majority of the countries are in favor, there is also a much smaller but still powerful group of countries which either actively stall or even always try to open up those 25, 27-year-old agreements that we have. Including the 1325 resolution from the Security Council. So it's a constant struggle, and those who want more, I would recommend to really show that political will and to fund those who fight, even fearing for their own lives, civil society in many of the countries with the most difficult circumstances.
Yes, thank you. So maybe before we move on to more conflict-related issues, what has been also set in our topic, I would like to ask one more empowerment-related question, and this is women in higher positions, which is always a question here. It always in Estonia creates a lot of emotions when we talk about quotas, but I would also like to ask from your experience, from your view, and also relating to the Secretary General of the United Nations, who has never been a woman. And when I was also last time posted to New York, when we were trying to open up the whole process of selecting the Secretary General, we actually had many good women also coming forward. But we ended up with an excellent Secretary General. But also regarding that, and also one notion which has been made that the Secretary General should be a woman, and maybe the chief of UN Women should be a man. So which has also caused a lot of turbulence in the past. So maybe your comments on that. Maybe we start with you, Ms. Regnér.
Yeah, thank you. You described the background. I think that power should always be shared, and women are constantly underrepresented. It is still only 25% of parliamentarians in the world, including in the EU on average, who are women. And when we speak about the EU, I'm sometimes amazed when you know that now since 20 years or so, women are the great majority of those leaving universities, both with degrees and with really good results, but we still keep these figures there. So this is really a power issue. It's not rational or anything else. The Secretary General is certainly a man. He has used his political power to enforce a program for parity, and has also reached 50% now of the highest positions are women and men respectively, as well as the resident coordinators, those who lead the UN work in the countries. It is a bit less on his special representatives in the peacekeeping missions, the SRSGs, but it is a rule that he is enforcing very profoundly, and I think everybody knows that. He has also changed all the instructions to these positions to work on gender equality. So I think that's an example of political will, although the UN is certainly also not a paradise. Always when there is power, more men are on the highest positions and have more power. We know when it comes to quotas, or as it is called in our language, temporary special measures, that they actually work. If you have a male dominance in decision-making bodies in politics, in parliaments mostly, it actually changes the political landscapes, and the changes stay on also after the temporary special measures, the quotas. And we see that when women have more power, they actually do prioritize other issues, such as children's rights, healthcare, women's rights, social infrastructure, and they allocate more money to that.
Thank you. Please, President.
Well, I have far less structured approach to this question. First and foremost, I would expect that I will never see anybody again in UN, of all places, high-level Women's Week. A woman prime minister walking into the room where panels are held and being asked, where is the prime minister? Because she didn't look really prime minister, relatively young, dressed in black, no makeup. I mean, this kind of habitual put down. Overall, the high-level Women's Week really helps a lot, because there people go and talk about these experiences. We do talk about these experiences. And I remember when one woman who is indeed in a relatively good job in UN structures, afterwards, after one of these sessions, stood up and said, look, it's very important, because I'm exiting at least 200 times a year an aeroplane and seeing those who have come to meet me sitting behind me, who is the important person. And this is going on. So actually having women in high jobs and having less women in high jobs, this is just a marker, one sign that things are not going well. But overall, things are not indeed going well. And even in UN, I mean, yes, we have made great progress in having women in jobs. UN Women has been created for many, this ticks boxes. But if we look, for example, peace resolutions, well, between 18 and 20, gender-based violence was not mentioned in any. Actually, the number of peace agreements where gender issues are discussed is decreasing, and it's not because of pandemic, because the highest number which was recorded was 2015, 37%. Now we are down to 25%. So while we are nominally doing a lot for women, then in practical terms, if you look, I mean, it's like, yes, we created these institutions, yes, we hire women, I mean, and then we do not look at the macro data anymore. Macro data actually is not showing that we are in good shape as far as women's position and women's even position in the discussions about the toughest situations globally is concerned. We are actually going backwards, and this is something which we should, to stop first, actually start talking about, otherwise we cannot change it. It's good to see how many women work and how many organizations we have, but let's look at the macro data and we see that we haven't made great progress.
Thank you. Yeah, you already made the introduction to the next kind of set of questions also relating to the women, peace and security agenda, and maybe trying to put the human face behind it. What does it actually mean? And it has also, of course, the two sides, that gender equality is weakened by armed conflicts. Also all these related sexual violence issues. But at the same time, as was mentioned, participation of women in conflict prevention and resolution is hugely important. And we have clear numbers also showing that where women are mediating peace, then it's much more sustainable, durable, even by 35% in the next 15 years, which is a very clear indication. So what has been achieved, and we know that Russia is even in the Security Council, what is happening now in this in these actions against Ukraine, but previously also trying to undermine the women, peace and security agenda there. Thankfully, it did not work in 2020, but these efforts are there, as we spoke about. So what could be done more to introduce gender perspectives into conflict resolution? Please go ahead.
Well, actually, during our stay in Security Council, bringing in testimony from women was an important part of our work. And I do believe that this does help actually, because listening to the real stories and being forced to look into the eyes of those who are suffering, who are not listened to, is important. Also for these people, it's very important that they are listened to. So we have taken various important steps. We have declared our objectives. We have, given women much more voice. If I think how many Afghan women were actually in New York giving testimony, but then from there onwards, we generally see that we are not able to maybe make such a difference. But I would say this is not only, specific to women's issues. Peace processes also, they stall, they take decades to push through. So actually I think we shouldn't also despair too much. Giving voice to women, making world to listen, to see, and therefore continue, persevere at what we are doing. But of course, annually we should indeed measure this kind of, was there a peace agreement where women issues were mentioned, not mentioned? This kind of simple thing helps us. But of course, it takes a lot of time. What I'm really worried also, thinking of the current conflict, is indeed that we hear quite a lot actually from the border that human trafficking is gathering speed. With millions of people on the move here in Europe, women certainly are facing risks that they might be forced into prostitution or forced labor. All these things are happening. I'm also worried that many of these women who might have suffered also rape are exiting to a country where abortion law is not exactly forthcoming to probably resolve a pregnancy which has stemmed from a traumatic experience, and so on. So we have a lot of work daily to do. Our NGOs are doing it, and the numbers do not still globally match up, which is in this sense negative, but the positive that imagine if we were not taking these steps, where would we then be? It would be far, far worse. And also I believe we all felt humbled by the fact how little we can do in Afghanistan. If Afghan National Army did not want to stand up and fight for the rights of their women and daughters, we can do nothing about it. Because we cannot go and set the world right. We cannot evacuate half of the nation. So there is a long way to go to make sure that different social formations accept women's rights, or at least the basic human rights of all women. This is something which we need to continue.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I obviously agree that on one level there are lots of progress being made, and obviously that's very important. And for example, we know that in these last years we've had 70% of the resolutions which include language on gender equality or women's rights, compared to only 15 in the years between 2000 and 2005. That is important. Last year, as another example, 60 women briefers were in the Security Council to brief. So these are good developments, but we have to be able to measure also progress in reality in women's and girls' lives, and there is a huge gap there. And many of you, I think, can really point to this and discuss that in whichever meeting you are, because it makes a big difference. I also think that when you see in a country that awful laws or so, for example, decriminalizing violence against women, that married men get the right from one day to the other to use violence against their wives, or extremely harsh abortion laws and so on. Those are signs many times that the country in general is not doing well in terms of democracy for anyone. And I think we've seen a lot of examples of that lately. But I do think that, for example, the UNAMA resolution, which was mentioned before, Norway's, Ireland's, others' leadership on that was very important. It has good language on women's rights, and it gives the UN, therefore, the tools to do what the UN can, including UN Women. UN Women is a secretariat to something called the Informal Experts Group in the Security Council, where all the countries are. Perhaps interesting to know that before, Russia and China were not active in the Informal Experts Group. Nowadays they are, and they say themselves that they want to be part of it because they want to see to their interests. Also, or maybe you have more on Ukraine, perhaps to get into what we concretely do there, because I think the women's rights movement's perspective is extremely important there. Yeah,
exactly. And that was leading to the next question, coming from the general women, peace and security agenda. And just to agree a lot that also during my 2 postings at the UN, when you had these testimonies at the Security Council by the women or any actually civil society representative, human rights defender, these are the stories we need to hear. Same now, going of course with Ukraine, and that was also my next question, because the whole day of course has been unfortunately based on this Russia's war against Ukraine, but also now maybe we can talk about a little more about the gender perspective of it, which is talked about, but I think we cannot forget it. And now maybe President Kaljulaid, we can start how Estonia is helping, what could be done more.
Well, first we have to look at the cultural context of every country where we have conflict and how to help them. In general, in Eastern Europe, I mean, women's position in society compared to many in society is not so bad. I mean, they have all the rights to participate in workforce, also aspire for higher jobs. I mean, is there a gender bias against them or not? I mean, this may differ from one country to another, but basically it all goes also under the assumption that, I mean, children are taken to school and kindergarten, 3 meals daily are cooked and house is clean. Thereafter, women are totally free to aspire for highest jobs. Don't laugh, this is the Eastern European truth. And therefore, we see Ukrainian women participating equally in the military conflict, actually in active combat. And therefore, what we can do, we should ask them, what are the specific needs of women fighters as well? Because there are women fighters. And in a way, I also feel very proud, and I think we should loudly talk about how proud we are about Ukrainian women standing beside their men to protect their children and so on, so on. But of course, it also means that there will be grandmothers with little children escaping Ukraine who definitely are in a different position compared to young women with children escaping to the free world. And I think we need kind of a specific tranche and specific activity to make sure that these children and these grandmothers who are coming with them here also are treated really well. And that's why, I mean, it's important to talk about this here in Tallinn, because we are so close. I mean, we know Ukrainian people, we see them coming over, we hear these stories, we have this testimony. We can broadcast to the whole world what is the situation and what needs to be done. Also, of course, I mean, this conflict is in this sense not different, that, I mean, violence against women very often, unfortunately, includes sexual violence. And we hear, I mean, this going on also in Ukraine. We should provide as much help as possible. Also, we cannot forget that there are pregnant women in Ukraine who are giving birth under fire, literally. I mean, hiding in the cellars, so on. Whatever can be done to keep babies warm, to send equipment to deal with premature babies or babies who have difficulties in maintaining temperature or breathing. I think all this help is very much welcome right now to Ukraine. And it's no less important than guns and ammunition, which of course is also a priority. Please keep supplying Ukraine, whose own stockpiles still allow it. Please keep doing it. But we should also deal with the softer issues.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that, as you know, and we heard before, that the UN is in Ukraine trying to provide humanitarian support, and UN Women is obviously part of that. And it's an important role for us to also inform those interventions in relation to women's rights and situation. And we just concluded a rapid, so-called rapid gender conflict analysis. It sounds technical, but it's a description about both women's situation and their needs, and you can find that also on our homepage if you're interested. If it's not there today, it will tomorrow, because it's very fresh. But it's important for us to keep in contact with reality and see to it that the UN responds to that. We are also there for almost on a daily basis. We have an office in Ukraine, And we also have one in Moldova, and we are working very intensely together with the rest of the system, UN system, but also with women's activists in Ukraine, who work enormously courageously under these very difficult circumstances. They, in their turn, reach out to women and children, perhaps those who can't move. Many rural women's contribution to agriculture in Ukraine is immense, and many women live in rural areas. The proportion of elderly women is much bigger than in other conflict areas, for example. And also the number of people, also women and mothers who have people who live with disabilities, or mothers who have children with disabilities, the numbers are so great compared to many other countries because Ukraine is a big country. All of that, these organizations try to map, try to support, try to find solutions. They kind of build chains between women to support these enormous needs. And because I speak with them so frequently, I am in such awe. I so admire their courage and their willingness to defend and protect other women under the worst circumstances. That's why I go to work every day. That drives me. But what we do, perhaps, to respond to their analysis from UN Women's side very concretely. Women who flee, yes, run the risk of trafficking, so we work with those organizations who are closest on the borders to try to support and prevent trafficking in different ways with knowledge about that. We also support women's organizations with money, with fresh money, and we have also managed to reprogram what we already did to provide them with support to the peaceful work that they are doing for other women and girls. We will also continue coming out with statistics and data to know what is happening to women and girls. We have sent experts to be part of the inquiry that we heard about that is mandated from the Human Rights Council to verify cases of rape and sexual violence during the conflict. We also support women's organizations and women so that they can prepare for moments of peace and for them to be part of important decision making, although the conflict is ongoing. And then, of course, we also support in the protection cluster, in the violence against women cluster, and in the health clusters within humanitarian response right now.
Yeah. Did you want to add something?
It just struck me that, we are seeing the conflict in the first world, in developed world, and that's why, it's very sad, but on the other hand, you recognize, we don't have to deal with, in Africa, with elderly women. It's simply not there. And there are many things which strike me, because we have to deal with these things, because this conflict is in the first world, in developed world. And the demands of the society of how to sustain them through this conflict are radically different, which only makes me even sadder for the less developed part of the world, obviously.
Thank you. Yes, I think we might also have time for a question or so from the audience, so you can prepare. But I wanted to also ask, because for President Kaljulaid and also for UN Women as in general, violence against women, now I'm talking about the general fight against violence against women, has been a very important topic, and you have made some progress as much as it is possible in this situation, what we talked about. But what kind of actual measures, President Kaljulaid, do you think are needed here in Estonia, in national level and international level? What would actually get us somewhere?
Well, trying to promote, but also never forgetting, who has been saying what when, for example, discussing acceptance of Istanbul Convention. And these words are burnt into my brain, that we will have in our trousers only a social construct if we approve. And because they are placed in my brain, it helped me to talk to a colleague from another country where they're trying to push the Istanbul Convention through, and they're having exactly the same kind of really relevant and memorable discussion in the parliament. Don't forget, and keep reminding, because people need to know also for whom they vote. I mean, and these issues cannot be pushed aside and said, okay, this was maybe, I mean, a parliamentary debate 10 years ago, it doesn't matter anymore. We have to, I mean, be very open about it, that, I mean, there are these tendencies which are strong in our societies, and it's not even, I mean, I sometimes see far more receptive, I mean, people in developing nations where they really realize that to leapfrog they need to empower the whole society, than I see here in our corner, where, for example, you see that if there is a really truly feminist government where there are mostly women prime ministers or women, what happens to misogynic parties' popularity? Have you monitored? Normally it spikes thereafter. Has been case in our case, in Finnish case. And I do think that we actually may see greater and bigger gains if we concentrate indeed in the developing world, because there are leaders who know that, I mean, promoting also girls gives them far quicker chances to exit from extreme poverty or reach the middle income countries' ranks. So we need to maybe concentrate our resources and efforts where this makes the biggest difference. Meanwhile, it doesn't take the responsibility away from our own citizens and electorate to keep thinking of these ideas and keep them on the agenda, because frankly speaking, no politician does for what there is no citizen demand in democratic nation. Mm-hmm. This is how it is. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Would you like to add something from the UN Women's side, violence against women? And
yeah, I think that a very important thing that we observe is that, as I said from the beginning, that we do see more, and I think that the 2017 Me Too movements and their sister movements, Neona Menos in Latin America, for example, that really changed the mind of many decision makers, and it opened eyes for many. And since then, we have much more and better legislation on violence against women. But it is, again, reality that is lagging behind. So I think that again, I think we see more and more every day that those basic women's rights issues and sexual and reproductive health and rights, for example, and violence against women, they are so connected to the core of democracy and human rights in general. So I hope we are moving away from a discussion where we see these as women's issues. Oh, that happened to women in that country. Poor women. Now they have a really bad legislation on violence against women. It happens to all of us, and it's part of repression. And I think that is very important to remember and also point out, even if the meeting is really about other issues.
But I think indeed this is something which I understand that in Estonia we have actually moved ahead and by leaps and bounds. I mean, there is no such thing like a separate issue of violence against women, even if, I mean, women of course suffer in the case of domestic violence, but the whole society, the aggression level in the whole society, I mean, depends very much on what people see at home. And if children learn, I mean, to establish their place in this world by violence, I mean, dear men, I mean, that guy who exits his car to break, I mean, your nose or your car because they were angry on the road, I mean, may come from the family where they saw this kind of violence. So there is no such a thing like, I mean, specifically violence against women, which we need to deal. It's about the aggression levels in the whole society. They are, I mean, inherently linked, and indeed, there are specific needs to help. And we can stratify, I mean, who suffers most, but overall, this is not the issue. I mean, the issue is the general level of aggressiveness in society. And I see how our needs are changing in this world, because with this technological world which we nowadays live in, I mean, children in kindergarten and in the school and just, I mean, don't learn any more empathy, just like we did. I mean, you had to go outside of your home to get on a bus here in Tallinn, you had to find a niche and you had to make sure that the grown-ups do not step on you because the bus was really full and so on, so on. You went to the shop, you needed to get money back. First realize, can you speak in Estonian? Maybe you cannot, okay, find a different. So we learned this kind of how to be part of the society, a human being, compassionate human being, able to establish my own rights without offending unnecessarily the others. Now, these new generations don't learn this by doing, because, I mean, their life is so computerized and technological that you can do all your everyday things, I mean, go shopping, go traveling, without ever ever talking to anybody. So I mean, body language is not learned automatically, and so I think in the most developed parts of the world, we need to really radically change our school curricula and teach children to be compassionate human beings, women and men equally. And this is something which I think we are about 15 years late to recognize. But if you now talk to Estonian school directors, at least everybody agrees. I'm quite sure we'll soon move as well.
Thank you. Thank you for this, because that was actually the aim, to bring all the human face into this discussion, because what I've also seen a lot, okay, women talking somewhere about women's issues, and it doesn't relate to anybody else. I saw it also a lot at the UN, unfortunately, as well. So I think that kind of general understanding of where it starts, it is. But we would have a time for one question or a comment. Yes, please. And there are two, so hopefully we'll manage two. Marianne Mikko, please. You can introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, my name is Marianne Mikko, Estonian, former member of Parliament and member of European Parliament. I figured out that we are still with 25% of parliamentarians all over the world. In Estonia, that's a little bit better, but not still there, like 1/3, which is needed that voice is heard. But I would like to get even further on. I rather like, instead of that kind of quotas, to have parity, which is about any numbers, but if we have half sky, half earth, and half power, how far we are and what kind of obstacles, because I think that is quite logical, quite normal, especially on the 21st century. So what is your comment? How far we are from that real demand, parity? Thank you.
Please. Ms. Regnér.
Yeah, actually last year the world decided that power should be 50-50 in decision-making bodies during last year's Commission on the Status of Women. So countries should work towards that. And as I said, I think that I actually also do think that societies where you have both women and men sharing power and responsibility, big labor forces with women and men, and reforms that facilitate for women and men to be both professional and parents, creates better societies for everybody. Both women and men live better lives in those societies. But it is also about power. And so I think that this is for everyone. Just if you are in a decision-making role, you have the responsibility to contribute to these agreements.
Countries and economies which have inflexible labor markets and rigid career structures where it takes everybody 30 years to reach a director's post are really bad also of helping women in the workforce. And we should everywhere try to therefore shake the labor markets loose as well, because if it takes 30 years to become a director, then those people who were hired 30 years ago are now becoming directors, and obviously they were in the male jobs, then they are men, and therefore things are linked. I think we should pay great attention that actually dealing with the issue of women, we are helping the whole society, even economically.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question there.
Thank you. I'm Pilet Sopagan and representative of civil society here, Women Against Violence Europe. And my first thought when I was listening to how UN Women is working in Ukraine, last week we had one webinar where Ukrainian women said that in addition to like addressing human trafficking, which is obvious and started immediately, is also somehow it has the surrogacy has to be addressed, because now they already have this reduced price surrogate Ukrainians advertisements. So this is something it should be really strongly somehow addressed. This was asked what these women asked. My question is, we haven't figured it out ourselves. We civil society are trying to engage men in how to change as a higher level, like leadership level of society, how to make this parity or equal leadership. Can you, as one UN organization, somehow advocate more amongst politicians, amongst countries, somewhat? Thank you.
Please go ahead, sir.
I think men and gender equality is a big topic, and I would be happy to come back and have a whole discussion on that, because I think it's really important, and I don't mean that to be funny. I think it's a really important issue. And so I believe that for UN Women and for the UN, and it's really important to have a systematic way of working to include women and men in gender equality work, but also really go through the barriers and the obstacles for a better shared power and responsibilities in society, and we are doing a lot on that. I think also when it comes to surrogacy, which you interestingly point out, I think that is for the UN doesn't have a position on surrogacy. I don't think the EU does either, but I do think that we need to discuss that, because women, some women find themselves in extremely difficult and dangerous situations because I think one very important message from us to our colleagues in the UN is to make sure that livelihood possibilities are offered by the receiving countries to women, so that they know right away that they can find dignified, decent work to provide for themselves and their children, as one example. But I do think we need a discussion about surrogacy that we haven't had internationally. And this is one reason for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pille, for that information. I'm sure in this auditorium there are also people who can help to deal with that problem. How to change societies? Well, I have 3 sons. I'm responsible, therefore. I mean, I let my teenagers to sink in dirt and dust, but I don't clean up their rooms. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it for a girl neither, but definitely not for a boy. And I think our generation's been pretty good in changing Estonian mindsets, because if I look around 30 years old, how proud they are walking their prams, and how Estonian young men are able to see the irony if then elderly people in the shop say, how nice a dad with 3 children. But if a woman is in the shop and the children are there, then this is natural. I think, it starts at the grassroots. It's our own job to teach and train the younger generation, and we're not doing a bad job. I have hope for this society, and unfortunately, each and every society has to reach it that, women have to do it. Women have to never to say to a girl that football is not a girl's sport, and so on.
Thank you. That was a very hopeful concluding statement to this talk. Thank you very much, President Kaljulaid, and also Regnér for being here. And I'm wishing you all a good following afternoon. Thank you so much for coming.
Please stay seated, everyone. We are continuing with the next session immediately.
Such a pleasure to meet you, Stanislav. Please, gentlemen, have a seat. Kuule, aga ütle, kuidas me näeme neid Zoomis osalejaid? Okay, I'll free myself of the mask.